Hey guys, I'm here to talk to you today about job interviews. How do you prepare for your job interviews? Are you thinking about the skills, knowledge, and experience in the job posting and thinking about the best way to show that you have all of those things? Are you thinking about the best way to tell your stories in a clear and concise way? I'm Matt and I'm here to give you 5 pieces of advice to help you best prepare and deliver for your interview. And if you find this video helpful, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel for when more videos are uploaded. I made this video with people early in their career in mind, but I do think the advice here can help anyone who has to do a job interview at any stage of their career. Number 1, preparing stories for your interview. Now, I'm sure you've heard about preparing stories for your interview, but I want to give you some pointers to make sure that the stories that you're preparing do the best job of conveying what your skills, knowledge, and ability are to the interviewer. So what you want to do is think about noteworthy parts of your career, think about where you had to overcome an issue, what some of the challenges were, what your specific contributions were, and what the positive outcomes were and your particular successes. You want to think about, in thinking about how to tell your story, what some of the relevant context would be so the interviewer understands the situation. And if you're early in your career, you may also want to consider thinking about academic examples as well. So what you're going to do is look at your stories and tag them with the skills, knowledge, and experience from the job posting to help you know which stories you can use to answer questions about each skill, knowledge, and experience. And this will help you realize, for example, that maybe you only have one really good leadership story, but you have several good teamwork stories. And so you know that when the leadership question comes up, you've got your one story, but you're not going to use that story if a teamwork question comes up because you know you have other good stories that show off those skills as well. And then once you've done this, you want to practice telling your stories. You want to make sure you sound comfortable and confident, but you don't want to sound over-rehearsed or robotic. You're trying to interact with the interviewer, you're trying to show off your personality, and you want to be able to roll with the punches if something comes up in the interview. Let's say, for example, the interviewer talks about something that they're working on with respect to a leadership development program, and you've worked on a leadership development program, but you weren't planning to talk about it. You might want to throw it in just so you can show that you were actively listening. And interviewers, well, all people tend to like having their words echo back to them even subconsciously. Also, you want to be able to adapt. Let's say the question that's asked is not the one you were predicting. You want to make sure you can tell your story. You want to adapt it to the question and make sure that you're not reciting from memory and that you can adapt to a situation you weren't expecting. Being comfortable speaking to your accomplishments going into an interview will also help you stay on focus, will help you make sure you're answering a question that's asked. And if ever you get in a situation where an interviewer asks a question but you're not quite sure what you want to say immediately, most interviewers will let you skip a question and come back to it. And so if you have this option, you should definitely take advantage of it rather than rambling and speaking on and hoping that you find your way to your point.
You could do so you want him to do you so much you could do anything.
When doing this, you risk that the interviewer loses complete sight of what you're trying to say, what your point was, and it loses the benefit of you explaining the thing that you did that was so good, that was something that they would want to take note of in making their decision of whether they want to hire you or not. Something you can do to make your life easier come interview prep time is to start logging your accomplishments in some kind of journal as they happen. If you write it down as it happens, it will be much easier to turn into a story when you're going into an interview situation. Number 2, use the terms I and we carefully and correctly. So if you've already watched my video on resumes, you know that I place a high importance on using I statements on your resume to explain the specific things that you've accomplished. If you're interested in checking out this video, I'll leave a link in the description. But as you go into an interview, this becomes even more important as you want to make sure the interviewer walks away clearly understanding what you are capable of. So as you prepare your stories for your interview, you want to make sure you're using I whenever you did something and that you're not using we. If you use we, even if others helped you in that particular situation, it becomes quite difficult for the interviewer to figure out what you specifically did and what your contribution was to the overall success on the project or initiative you're talking about. Now, I'm also not suggesting that you lie or exaggerate about your contributions or your successes. Everybody knows that it takes a number of people to pull off a large initiative or a project, so that an interviewer won't be surprised to hear that you didn't do everything on your own. But you do want to make sure you're making it clear what your contribution was, what your success was, and what you did that specifically contributed to the overall success of the project or initiative that you were describing. You want to make sure that they don't think that you're also taking credit for the whole project either by saying "I" when you're describing something that the team did. Overall, you just want to make sure the interviewer knows what you are capable of. You need to remember that an interviewer is just getting to know you. The entirety of what they know about you is based on what you were telling them. So if you're not making it easy for them to understand, they're not going to know what you want them to know. Now, at some points in our career, we may find ourselves interviewing in front of someone who actually does know what we've done and does know what our contributions are. And if you find yourself in this situation, although it may feel awkward, I suggest that you still explain clearly what your contributions are, what your successes were, and what your contributions to the overall positive outcomes on the project were. And this is because although that specific person may know you well, other panelists on the interview may not, and in many cases in interviews, you're being evaluated on what you specifically say, and the outside knowledge of the interviewer does not come into play. So you want to make sure that you say the things that you've done so that they can be evaluated accordingly. So back to how to structure your interview answers using the words I and we, you may want to talk about how you specifically did the research. You specifically came up with the options. You specifically pitched the idea to your management team, and you specifically got it approved, and you got it in play. And by contrast, you might want to say, we had some challenges in terms of you and your team trying to communicate out. You might want to say, we as an organization had to struggle with how to outreach to employees who weren't familiar with this sort of thing. So you want to separate out the context and when other people were involved, but you want to make sure you're not talking about we when you're talking about the research that was done or the approval process that you went through to get the initiative moved forward, because then the interviewer may be left wondering whether it was actually you who did that work, or if it was somebody else, or if you only did a small part compared to other people on the team. Describing your leadership experience is a careful balance between making sure that you show how you enabled your team to succeed while also giving credit to those people who did all of the work. You know in this case that it was one of your employees that was in charge of the research and the approval process, but you want to talk about how you enabled them to succeed. So for example, maybe you want to talk about how you met with senior stakeholders in advance to get buy-in for the initiative. Maybe you want to talk about how you met with the finance department to get a budget for this project. Maybe you want to talk about how, based on the success of the initiative, that you were able to create a new department that looks at wellness on a go-forward basis. We're describing the same situation here, but we're talking about the contributions in a far different way. Now, one last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of I versus we is that research shows that women typically understate their experience and ability in a job interview situation. I'm going to leave a link to a Society of Human Resources Management article that covers this in more depth, but for the purposes of this video, be keenly aware of using we in a way that mitigates what you can do, that mitigates the impact of what you did, that mitigates your successes and your experience. You want to make sure that you're very clearly communicating what you're capable of, and you don't want to use qualifying statements either like, I did that but I had a lot of help, or I did that but it was really a team effort. If that's true, yeah, as I said earlier, you don't want to lie or exaggerate, but make sure that you're not reflexively doing this in a way that takes away credit from yourself, that weakens the impact of your story in the interview situation. Number 3, make sure you actually answer the question. Now, this may seem like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised how easy it is to lose track of a question when you're feeling nervous or anxious when you're sitting in that interview chair. And a lot of times interview questions have several parts. They may have 2, 3, 4 parts to them. It's not uncommon to have a question like, tell me about a time that you had a workplace conflict. What happened? What did you do to resolve it? And what would you do differently next time? What was the outcome? That question had arguably 4 or 5 different parts to it, and you want to make sure that when you're done answering the question that you covered every single thing that was asked. This isn't unlike university when you're answering a short answer or an essay question and you went through the different parts of the prompt and you underlined all the different aspects to make sure that you didn't miss anything. And in most interview situations, you're able to take notes and write down the different parts of the question as they're asked. And I suggest that you take advantage of this and that you at least try to note down the key points to make sure that you don't miss any. And if you are unsure of how to answer a question right away, you can ask the interviewer to repeat the question. This will also buy you a little time to think about what you might want to say. As we talked about earlier, it's better to stop and regroup and collect your thoughts and make sure you're giving a good answer than to ramble on and risk the interviewer not understanding your point.
I believe that our education, such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere such as, and I believe that they should, our education over here.
And as I mentioned earlier, you may also have the option of asking the interviewer to skip the question and come back to it. And if you have this option and you feel like you need it, you shouldn't hesitate to use it. Sometimes, if you miss a part of the question, the interviewer will probe for more information, but sometimes they won't. And you really don't want to leave it up to the interviewer to ask you questions to make sure that you cover everything. You want to make sure that in every situation, you're putting your best forward and giving the most complete information possible to set you up best to be selected for the job that you're applying for. Number 4, research the organization you're interviewing with and be prepared to answer questions about it. Now, if you've already watched my video about my advice to help you find your dream job, you've seen me go through how you can research organizations on Glassdoor, LinkedIn, and Google. I'll leave a link to that in the description if you're interested. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to talk to you about what kinds of information you want to look at and how you should prepare to use in an interview. One of the things you're going to want to do is take a look at the organization's mission statement and values. This gives you an idea of what's really important to that organization and gives you the opportunity to think about how you can work those things into your interview. Now, the other thing you're going to look for embedded in here is any parts of the mission statement or any values that are directly related to your job. If in reviewing the core values for the organization, you find diversity and inclusion in the list, and you're applying for a human resources job, you're really going to want to think about how to incorporate diversity and inclusion into your stories to make sure they are referenced in your interview. This will show that you've researched the organization in advance, and/or it will show that what you bring to the table is aligned with the core values that this organization has. Hopefully you've already done some research about this organization if you're going into the interview stage, so you have a pretty good idea of what they're all about, but you want to make sure you familiarize yourself as much as possible. Going into an interview, you just want to have an idea of some things that they may ask about that you might not expect. For example, in one organization I worked with, a question about safety was always asked, even for jobs that had nothing to do with safety. And it would be hard for someone to prepare for that question or to expect that, but if you see safety consistently coming up in the core values of the organization, it might give you a hint. Now, don't go too far the other way either and panic and think that I'm saying that you should memorize the organization's complete corporate plan or familiarize yourself with every single thing that they highlight on their About Us page. You just want to get an idea, have a general flavor, and be able to speak intelligently about the things that matter to the organization. You may also want to look at what's being discussed in the media about the organization. This is particularly true if it's a large organization or one that gets lots of public attention, or even if it is a public sector organization itself. This will give you an idea of what some of the challenges they're facing at this time. So let's say you're interviewing at a healthcare provider. You look at the media coverage, you look at their press releases, and budgetary and financial challenges are discussed at length. At the same time, you know the COVID-19 pandemic is continuing to roar on, and as a result, you could expect that this would also put budgetary pressures on such an organization. Well, knowing this, in an interview in response to a question about how you might solve a problem, you may not want to propose a really expensive solution. You may want to think about how to answer the question by reallocating existing resources, utilizing existing infrastructure, and finding cost-effective or even cost-free solutions where possible. It's not that proposing a solution with a cost would be necessarily some kind of deal breaker for an interviewer, but if you propose a solution that falls more in line with the realities of the organization and the challenges they're facing, it may give you a leg up on the competition and show your recognition of the specific challenges of that organization. Now, in preparing for an interview, do I think that doing this kind of research is more important than making sure that you're comfortable talking about your skills, knowledge, and experience and showing the value you bring to the table? Absolutely not. But I do think that having a baseline understanding of the organization you're applying to can really give you a competitive advantage. You have enough work to do preparing for an interview, so just do your best to be as familiar as possible with the organization as you can. But when you're in the interview and the interviewer at the end of the interview says something like, well, when you said this, you hit the nail on the head, or it seems like you really understood what you were talking about when you talked about this, This is a good feeling and shows that you connected with the interviewer and the organization. And that's the kind of connection you want to make with the interviewer to make sure that you're a memorable candidate and one that is worthy of selection for the job that you're interviewing for. Number 5, make sure you have some questions prepared for the interview. Now, in my view, there's at least 2 really good reasons to ask a question at an interview. The first is to get more information about whether you'd actually want to accept the role if it's offered to you. Number 2 is to show off your knowledge of the organization and show off some of that research that you've done in advance. With respect to the first type of question, the one that helps you get information about whether you want to accept a role at this organization, theoretically you've done some research in advance and you already have a pretty good idea if you'd accept a job with this organization or not. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be taking an interview with them. However, for all the research that you do online, you just can't get all the answers from the internet. And so asking questions at the interview helps you fill in some blanks. And you'd be surprised at what you could learn from asking a seemingly innocent question of the interviewer. One time when I went to an interview, I asked about the work-life balance in the job. And in response, the interviewer said that my question was brave. She then proceeded to tell me that the work-life balance was in fact decent in the role. But the way she responded in calling the question brave was a bit of a red flag to me. Again, you'd be surprised what kind of information you can get from asking a seemingly innocent question. In terms of the second kind of question, the one that shows off your organizational knowledge, you should prepare a question in advance about something that you turned up in your research on the organization. For example, the Toronto Police Services did a complete review of basically everything they were doing and released a comprehensive report called A Way Forward. Throughout the report, there were many references to human resources, but there were 3 major themes overall. The first was that HR needed to completely change its strategy, that HR needed to facilitate a changing culture across the whole organization, and number 3, diversity and inclusion would be a key priority in ensuring that the police force reflects the demographics of the communities that they serve. And so in light of this information, a question that could be asked at the interview could be something like, I saw that these 3 themes emerged, and you can say the 3 themes, and then you could ask, what stage of the strategy development are we at? Will my role be critical in that? And if the strategy is already developed, how will it impact my role? This shows that you've absorbed some key information about the organization and also has the dual benefit of telling you some information about what your job experience might be like. Now, if you can't find this kind of information in your research, you can also look back at the job posting. The job posting often includes some information like this, but you can also look at the skills, knowledge, and experience to give you some hints about the job and possibly give you some avenues to ask questions. For example, if you're applying for a non-project management role, but project management skills and experience are required in the job posting, you may want to ask a question about this. This will show that you've reviewed the materials available and will again give you an idea of what the job experience might be like if you accept the role if offered to you. Or if that doesn't turn up something you want to ask a question about, you can also ask a question about a major organizational or world event. For most interviews, a question about how COVID-19 has affected their business will be a good one. So if you're applying for a training role, for example, you could ask, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the way that we administer our training programs? Do we rely on more vendors now? Is there more virtual training? When I go to an interview, I personally like to ask at least one of each type of question, but if you don't want to do this, I would suggest that you ask at least one question total. You don't want the interview to end with the interviewer asking you if you have any questions and you saying no, and then the interview kind of just peters out. You want to leave on a high note, you want to leave making a good impression, and you want to make sure that your presence was memorable to these interviewers and that they ultimately want to select you for the role. So those are my 5 pieces of advice to help you make sure that you prepare as well as you can for the interview and that you execute on the day of the interview perfectly. One other thing I wanted to highlight is don't forget that you're not only at an interview to showcase your skills, knowledge, and experience and to showcase your understanding of the organization, you're also there to show off your personality. Interviewers aren't just hiring a list of skills or a resume, they're looking for a person to join their team. They're looking for a team member that they will enjoy working with. They're looking for someone that will fit in with their culture. So don't hesitate to find opportunities to connect with the interviewer, to use humor if that's something that is appropriate for you, and just find opportunities to stand out, not just based on your resume, but based on the unique personality that you bring to the table. Thanks for sticking it out to the end of the video. If you found it helpful, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel for when more videos are uploaded. What are you going to change about your interview prep? Are you going to tweak some of those stories you have? Are you going to create your journal of accomplishments that you're going to maintain on an ongoing basis? Are you going to do more research in advance of your interviews? Let me know in the comments. You bring a lot to the table, and I know in your next interview, you're going to make sure the interviewer knows it. Have a great one. Bye.